Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
There is a version of him you never met. Not because it wasn't real, but because he spent most of the relationship trying to hide it from you. And honestly, from himself too. The strange part is some men don't fully realize what they felt until everything goes quiet. Not during the relationship. Not during the intimacy. Not even during the moments where they almost said something real and then laughed off to seconds later. It happens later, in stupid moments. While standing in the kitchen at 1:14 a.m. eating leftovers straight out of the container. While hearing a song he pretended not to like. While opening your chat, scrolling up for no reason, then locking the phone the second guilt hits his chest. And if you asked him directly, "Did you love her?" he'd probably pause too long before answering. Because part of him still doesn't know how to separate love from fear, or closeness from loss of control, or why he pushed away the one person he secretly checked his phone for every morning. This isn't really about what men say. It's about the things they carry silently, while acting completely normal. The emotional panic hidden inside delayed replies. The shame after vulnerability. The weird distance that appears right after intimacy. The way some men miss someone hardest when they finally have enough space to stop performing. And maybe the hardest part. Sometimes he did care, deeply. He just didn't know how to stay emotionally present without feeling exposed. So instead, he became confusing. Cold after closeness. Quiet after tenderness. Detached while secretly replaying everything. And no, that doesn't excuse the damage. But if you've ever sat there thinking, why did he act like it meant everything one moment and nothing the next? This conversation might feel uncomfortably familiar. The confusing part wasn't the distance. It was how sudden it felt. 1 week he was there constantly, sending things that reminded him of you, calling late at night just to say something pointless, because apparently hearing your voice had quietly become part of his routine, asking if you got home safe, remembering tiny details he pretended weren't important. And then something shifted. Not loudly. That's the thing people don't talk about enough. Most emotional withdrawal doesn't happen dramatically. It happens in tiny behavioral changes that almost make you feel guilty for noticing them. The replies get slightly flatter. He still answers technically, but the warmth leaves first. Then the pauses get longer. Then, suddenly you're staring at a message timestamp trying to convince yourself you're not becoming that person for noticing the difference between a 7-minute reply and a 7-hour one. And maybe somebody watching from the outside would say, just give him space. But your body already felt it before your mind could explain it. Something changed. And honestly, sometimes he feels it too while it's happening. That's the strange part. A lot of men pull away while simultaneously feeling attached, which sounds manipulative until you realize some of them genuinely don't understand what's happening internally either. Because closeness feels good right up until it starts feeling emotionally dangerous. And most men are never taught how to handle that transition. So instead of saying, "I'm getting emotionally overwhelmed," or "This is starting to matter too much to me," he says he's tired, busy, stressed, needs space, needs to focus on work. Sometimes he even believes that's the real reason, partially because admitting the deeper truth would force him to confront something uncomfortable. This relationship is affecting him emotionally in ways he can no longer control casually. And that realization does something weird to certain men. It doesn't always make them softer. Sometimes it makes them colder. Not intentionally. Not consciously. Almost defensively. Like the emotional system starts locking doors automatically. You can actually watch it happen in real time sometimes. A woman reaches for deeper emotional intimacy, and suddenly he starts acting slightly emotionally unavailable in microscopic ways. He becomes more sarcastic, less expressive, less present during conversations. He still shows up physically, but emotionally he's standing near the exit already. Not because he wants to leave necessarily, but because vulnerability started making his nervous system feel exposed. And unfortunately, some men confuse emotional exposure with loss of control. So they retreat before they can fully understand what they're retreating from. There's usually a moment before the distance fully happens. A very specific moment. Not dramatic enough to become a movie scene. Just human enough to haunt him later. Maybe she looked at him too softly after intimacy. Maybe she said, "You know you can talk to me, right?" And something in his chest tightened instead of relaxed. Because people assume men are afraid of commitment itself. A lot of the time, that's not actually true. What scares him is being emotionally known. Fully known. Not admired. Not desired. Known. The kind of closeness where somebody notices the shift in your breathing before you speak. The kind where they hear the sadness underneath your jokes. The kind where they start seeing your emotional habits before you've admitted them to yourself. That kind of intimacy changes people. And not everyone handles it well. Especially men who learned early in life that emotions are safest when managed privately. So now, he's sitting there beside someone who makes him feel calm and exposed at the exact same time. And his body doesn't know how to process both experiences together. Part of him wants to stay longer. Another part starts quietly planning emotional escape routes. It's ugly to admit that, but it's real. Sometimes he pulls away directly after moments that meant the most to him, which completely confuses the other person, because from her perspective the intimacy deepened. From his perspective now there's more to lose. That fear changes behavior fast, and not always rationally. Sometimes after a deeply emotional night together, he suddenly becomes distant the next morning. Not because the night meant nothing, sometimes because it meant too much. And instead of sitting inside the vulnerability, he overcorrects. You'll see it in tiny things. Checking his phone too often, becoming weirdly distracted, talking about random surface-level topics after intense emotional closeness. Sometimes even physically leaving too quickly afterward, like his body is trying to regulate something his mind hasn't caught up to yet. Then later, hours later, he thinks about her constantly, but by then the silence has already started, and pride enters the room. Pride ruins so many emotionally honest moments, because once distance begins, now there's ego involved too. Now he notices the silence, but doesn't want to be the first one to address it. So he waits. Then she feels hurt and becomes quieter herself. Then he interprets her emotional protection as detachment. And suddenly to people who actually miss each other are sitting alone in separate rooms, pretending they're just giving space. Meanwhile, he's doing things that make absolutely no sense logically. Opening her social media. Watching stories quickly so his name disappears lower in the viewer list. Typing responses in his notes app instead of sending them. Replaying conversations while driving, especially while driving. There's something brutally honest about men alone in cars at night. No distractions, no performance, just thoughts they were out running all day finally catching up. And the memories that hit aren't usually dramatic. That's what makes it worse. It's tiny things. Her sitting cross-legged in the passenger seat. The way she'd say drive safe twice. Her getting quiet when something hurt her instead of arguing immediately. The sound of her bracelet hitting a coffee cup while she talked. Tiny things become emotionally violent later. especially in silence. And silence affects men differently than people realize. A lot of men can function normally while emotionally falling apart internally. Go to work, answer emails, laugh with friends, then suddenly feel emotionally wrecked because they passed a restaurant they ate at together once 6 months ago. The body remembers emotional attachment in inconvenient moments. That's why some men become emotionally inconsistent after pulling away. One day he sounds distant. The next day he reaches out casually like nothing happened. Not because he's always playing games. Sometimes because he genuinely misses the connection while still fearing the vulnerability attached to it. So his behavior becomes contradictory. Hot when he feels lonely, cold when closeness returns, available from a distance, uncomfortable up close. And honestly, the inconsistency hurts people deeply, especially women who start questioning their own emotional reality because his behavior keeps changing. One version of him acts deeply attached, the other acts emotionally unreachable, and both versions are real. That's the uncomfortable truth. Some men are emotionally split in ways they don't fully understand themselves. There's the part that craves intimacy, and the part that associates intimacy with emotional risk, obligation, exposure, dependency, loss of freedom, sometimes even shame. So when love starts feeling emotionally serious, he doesn't always feel relief. Sometimes he feels pressure. Not pressure from her necessarily. Pressure from himself. Pressure to sustain vulnerability. To stay emotionally present consistently. To not disappoint someone who sees good in him. And if he already secretly struggles with emotional inadequacy, that pressure can quietly turn into avoidance. Not because he feels nothing, because he feels too much and doesn't trust himself with it. There's usually a moment where he almost reaches out honestly. Almost. Usually late at night. The emotional honesty window. Everybody has one. That strange are where distractions stop working and the truth gets louder. He opens the chat, reads old messages, starts typing. Hey, I know I've been distant. Delete. I don't really know what's wrong with me lately. Delete. I miss you. Long pause. Delete again. Then eventually sends something emotionally safer. How's your week been? And even that took 30 minutes. Because vulnerability feels simple in theory until you're the one risking rejection. Until you're the one admitting somebody affected you deeply. And maybe the saddest part is, sometimes she interpreted his withdrawal as indifference, when internally it was confusion, fear, emotional immaturity, shame, attachment, longing, pride, all tangled together so badly even he couldn't separate them clearly. That doesn't erase the damage. Distance still hurts. Silence still creates insecurity. Emotional inconsistency still leaves people anxious and exhausted. But if you've ever wondered how a man can act deeply connected one moment then emotionally disappear the next, sometimes the answer is painfully human. He got scared by how real it became, and instead of saying that honestly, he went quiet. The strange thing is, he probably doesn't replay the moments you think he does. People imagine men obsess over the dramatic parts, the breakup conversation, the last kiss, the final phone call. And yes, sometimes those memories come back too. But usually, the memories that stay lodged inside him are painfully small, almost stupidly small. A random Tuesday afternoon where nothing important technically happened. You sitting on the kitchen counter talking about your day, while he pretended to scroll through his phone even though he was listening to every word. The way you said his name absent-mindedly while looking for your keys. The 5 seconds after a joke landed where you laughed harder than expected and leaned into him without thinking. Tiny things. That's what ruins him later. Not because they were extraordinary, because they were ordinary. Real intimacy hides inside ordinary moments. And men often don't realize they're emotionally attaching during those moments until long after they're gone. That's the tragic timing of it. Sometimes he doesn't fully feel the emotional weight while it's happening. He's present but only partially aware. Then months later, he's standing in a grocery store staring at a brand of pasta sauce because she once made fun of how aggressively he stirred sauce like it offended him personally. And suddenly his chest hurts. Not dramatically, just enough to make him stand still for a second too long. That's how memory works sometimes, especially emotional memory. It sneaks up through details. A smell, a phrase, the sound of someone laughing in a similar cadence. And the worst part, the memories that replay are often the ones where she had no idea he was emotionally affected at all. Because men are not always obvious when they're falling emotionally deeper. Sometimes the attachment hides underneath routine behavior. He starts memorizing things accidentally. Her coffee order, the side of the bed she naturally drifts toward, the expression she makes when overstimulated in crowded places, the way her voice changes slightly when she's tired, but trying not to complain. He notices more than he admits. Way more. But a lot of men don't verbalize attachment while it's happening. They embody it quietly instead. Picking up her favorite snack without mentioning it. Checking traffic before she drives home. Walking slightly slower because she talks more openly when walking. Little behavioral adjustments that don't look emotional from the outside, but they are. Deeply. The problem is sometimes women interpret the lack of verbal reassurance as lack of feeling. Meanwhile, he's internally building emotional associations everywhere without saying a word. And later those associations become emotional landmines. A hoodie she left behind. A song he barely even liked until it became connected to her somehow. An inside joke that randomly resurfaces while he's brushing his teeth. It's almost embarrassing how long tiny memories can survive inside someone emotionally unavailable. Especially because he'll often act completely normal publicly. That's another thing people misunderstand. Men can miss someone intensely while looking emotionally functional. He can answer work emails while thinking about her. Laugh at dinner with friends while mentally replaying one specific conversation from 7 months ago. Sometimes he doesn't even realize he's doing it until afterward. Like suddenly noticing he drove home in complete silence because his brain was somewhere else entirely. And the memory loops are weirdly specific, not cinematic. Human. He remembers the exact moment she got quiet in the middle of a sentence because she realized she'd accidentally revealed something vulnerable. He remembers pretending not to notice because he didn't want her to feel embarrassed. He remembers the night she fell asleep on the couch for 20 minutes and acted mortified afterward for no reason. He remembers her asking, "Can I tell you something weird?" before saying something painfully honest in the softest voice imaginable. Those moments stay, especially the unguarded ones, because deep down what affects him most emotionally is usually not perfection. It's authenticity. Seeing someone unmasked for half a second. That changes people. Even men who later act emotionally detached. And honestly, sometimes the memories become more emotionally intense after separation because now there's no new interaction interrupting them. No updated reality. Only replay. That's dangerous. Because replay romanticizes it selectively. Now, he's alone at night remembering details he barely acknowledged in real time. The way she used to fix the sleeves of oversized sweaters by covering her hands completely when anxious. The way she'd pause movies to over-explain scenes emotionally. The tiny annoyed face she made when he interrupted her story accidentally. And suddenly these microscopic memories feel emotionally enormous. Not because they objectively are, because they belong to someone who mattered. There's usually one memory he returns to more than others. One weirdly specific moment. And it's rarely the obvious one. Sometimes it's painfully mundane. Like sitting in traffic together. Windows cracked slightly. No music playing. Both of them tired. And for some reason, he remembers feeling peaceful. Not excited. Not obsessed. Not overwhelmed. Just calm. And maybe that scared him more than anything. Because some men are used to chaos feeling like chemistry. So when something feels emotionally safe instead, they don't immediately recognize its value. Not until later. Later is where male regret becomes emotionally intelligent. And fortunately, there's also something uncomfortable about how memory interacts with avoidance. Because the more emotionally avoidant he is, the more likely he was suppressing feelings in real time. Which means the emotions show up later through memory instead. Delayed emotional processing. That's why certain men seem emotionally unaffected initially after distance or breakup. Then suddenly collapse internally months later over something seemingly insignificant. A smell in a hallway. A voicemail. A random picture buried in his camera roll. And suddenly the emotional reality catches up violently. Not all at once. In waves. That's the part people don't see. The emotional waves. He's fine for 3 days. Then one tiny thing destabilizes him emotionally for the entire night. And because men are often socially conditioned to minimize emotional experiences, he doesn't always process these moments openly. He internalizes them privately, which creates bizarre behavior, like opening her profile repeatedly without interacting, looking at old photos, then immediately feeling stupid afterward, deleting and re-downloading apps during emotional overwhelm, convincing himself he's just curious. He's not. Not usually. He misses the emotional familiarity, even if he was the one who pulled away. Especially then, honestly. Because distance creates room for memory to become louder than ego temporarily. There's a specific kind of loneliness that hits men when they realize nobody else knows their tiny routines the way she did. Nobody else knows he gets quiet when stressed instead of angry. Nobody else notices when he's pretending to be okay, but tapping his fingers differently. Nobody else texts, "Did you eat today?" in the exact tone that somehow felt both caring and mildly threatening. People underestimate how attached men become to emotional familiarity. Even emotionally unavailable men. Maybe especially emotionally unavailable men. Because once someone bypasses his emotional defenses enough to become psychologically familiar, losing them creates a strange internal silence. And he notices it in stupid moments. Reaching for his phone to send her something before remembering he can't. Hearing good news and instinctively thinking, "I should tell her." Seeing something funny and still mentally composing the message automatically. The body creates habits around emotional connection long before pride catches up. That's why some men keep replaying old conversations internally. Not because they're trying to suffer, because part of the brain is still emotionally orienting towards someone who used to matter daily. And sometimes the replay becomes self-punishment too. He remembers moments where she needed reassurance and he gave distance instead. Moments where she was emotionally honest and he deflected with humor. Moments he could have softened but didn't. That's where regret starts becoming painfully specific. Not abstract guilt. Specific guilt. Specific sentences. Specific facial expressions. Specific moments where he now realizes, she was trying to connect with me there. And maybe the saddest thing about emotionally avoidant men is, they often understand emotional intimacy most clearly in retrospect. When there's nobody left to perform for, nobody left to impress, Nobody left to defend themselves against emotionally. Just memory. Just honesty. Just the unbearable replay of small moments that didn't seem important enough at the time. There's usually one memory that hurts him unexpectedly. Not because it was dramatic, because it revealed love in its simplest form. Maybe she reached over absent-mindedly and fixed his color mid-conversation. Maybe she saved him the last bite of something without mentioning it. Maybe she looked at him during a crowded dinner table conversation like he was the safest thing in the room. Tiny moments. That's the part people don't tell you. Love rarely destroys emotionally unavailable men through grand gestures. It destroys them through accumulated tenderness they failed to value correctly while it was still happening. And long after the relationship changes. Long after the silence. Long after he insists he's moved on. Some painfully human part of him is still replaying moments you probably forgot 5 minutes after they happened. Because to him, those moments quietly became home before he even realized he was living there. One of the most confusing things a man can do is become distant right after a moment that felt deeply intimate. And I don't mean days later. I mean immediately after. Like something emotionally shifted inside him the second the closeness became real. 1 minute he's soft, open, present in a way that almost makes you exhale internally because finally he's letting you in. Then suddenly he changes. His tone gets flatter. He reaches for his phone too quickly, makes a joke that feels emotionally out of place, acts distracted. Sometimes he physically leaves earlier than expected. And if you're on the receiving end of that behavior, it can make you feel insane. Because your body just experienced connection, while his behavior suddenly starts communicating withdrawal. So now you're lying there mentally replaying the last 30 minutes trying to figure out what happened. Did I say too much? Was he pretending the whole time? Did intimacy scare him? Did he regret it afterward? And the painful thing is, sometimes even he doesn't fully know. Not in the moment. Because a lot of men experience emotional closeness physically before they understand it emotionally. Their body relaxes first. Their guard drops first. Their tenderness appears first. Then later their mind catches up and goes, oh no. That's the part people rarely talk about honestly. Sometimes intimacy creates panic. Not because the intimacy was bad, because it was emotionally real. And emotional reality can feel terrifying to people who learn to survive through control, detachment, independence, emotional compartmentalization, whatever version of self-protection they built years ago. There's a specific vulnerability that happens after intimacy, especially after moments where emotional tenderness slips through accidentally, like when he holds her a little longer than usual afterward, or says something honest without planning to, or gets unexpectedly quiet because he suddenly feels emotionally seen. That silence afterward matters. A lot happens inside it. People assume silence means absence of feeling. Sometimes silence means too much feeling happening at once. Too much exposure. Too much closeness entering the body too quickly. And men are often deeply unprepared for what emotional exposure feels like physically. Because yes, physically, nobody talks enough about how emotional vulnerability actually affects the body. His breathing changes. His chest tightens. His nervous system becomes hyper-aware. Sometimes he suddenly feels restless right after moments of closeness. Like he needs movement immediately. Needs distraction. Needs to reestablish emotional distance before the vulnerability settles too deeply. Which is why some men suddenly become task-oriented after intimacy. Cleaning something. Checking notifications. Talking about random practical things. Not because they don't care. Sometimes because their body is trying to regulate emotional overwhelm without admitting that's what's happening. and honestly, can look incredibly hurtful from the outside, especially because women often become emotionally softer after intimacy, more open, more connected, more reassured, while he's internally experiencing something entirely different: exposure, dependency, fear, the realization that somebody now emotionally matters enough to hurt him. That realization changes behavior fast, especially in men who associate emotional dependence with weakness, loss of identity, or eventual abandonment. So now there's this terrible contradiction happening internally. Part of him wants more closeness. Another part starts emotionally backing away the second he receives it. And if he's emotionally immature, he won't explain any of this. He'll just become confusing. That's what emotional avoidance often looks like in real life. Not cruelty exactly. Confusion acted out behaviorally. He becomes less affectionate right after deep connection. Not because he feels less, because he suddenly feels too visible. There's also shame involved sometimes. A really quiet kind, especially for men who spent years building identities around emotional self-sufficiency. Because intimacy exposes needs, and some men hate discovering they have emotional needs at all. That sounds harsh, but it's true. A man who prides himself on emotional independence can become deeply uncomfortable realizing one person suddenly has the ability to calm him emotionally, or affect his mood, or become the first person he wants to tell things to. That level of attachment creates vulnerability, and vulnerability creates fear. So sometimes, after intimacy, he subconsciously tries to regain emotional control by becoming colder, more distant, less expressive, almost like he's trying to undo how emotionally open he just became. You can actually see this conflict happen in tiny moments. She reaches for him afterward, and his body hesitates for half a second too long, not rejecting her exactly, just recalibrating emotionally. Or he suddenly starts talking differently, more detached, more casual, like he's trying to pull the emotional intensity back down before it reaches somewhere he can't manage internally. And honestly, sometimes he hates himself for it afterward. That's the part people don't see, the private guilt. Because deep down he knows she felt the shift. Women usually do, especially emotionally intuitive women. They feel the emotional temperature change immediately, even when he insists nothing's wrong. And maybe technically nothing is wrong. But something happened. He got emotionally overwhelmed, which is not the same thing as emotionally disconnected. But to the other person it can feel identical. That's where so much relational confusion comes from. One person experiences intimacy as deepening connection. The other experiences intimacy as increasing emotional risk. Same moment, completely different internal realities. There's usually a specific second where the panic begins, and it's rarely dramatic. Sometimes it's almost unbearably tender. She falls asleep against his chest. She looks at him too softly. She says something simple like, "I feel safe with you." And instead of just receiving it, something inside him tightens. Not because he wants to hurt her, because now there's emotional responsibility attached to the connection. Now he knows she trusts him. Now he knows he could break something real. And emotionally avoidant men often become more anxious when they are deeply cared for, not less, because love creates stakes. Now there's something to lose. Now there's expectation. Now there's emotional accountability. And if he secretly doubts his ability to sustain emotional intimacy consistently, he may begin withdrawing before he disappoints her fully. That's the tragic logic underneath some masculine distancing. If I pull away now, maybe I can avoid failing later. Of course, it usually creates the exact pain he was trying to avoid. But emotionally defensive behavior is rarely rational in the moment. It's protective, reactive, sometimes childish, honestly. And intimacy has a way of exposing emotional immaturity brutally fast, especially after the emotional high settles. That's another thing people don't mention enough. After deep intimacy, there's often an emotional crash. Not because the connection wasn't meaningful, because vulnerability consumes energy, especially for people who spend most of their lives emotionally guarded. For a few hours, he let himself soften completely, and afterward his system almost overcorrects. Like, that was too much openness, too much feeling, too much dependence. So now he becomes quieter, more withdrawn, sometimes even irritated, not necessarily at her, at himself, at how emotionally affected he feels, at how quickly she got past his defenses, at how badly part of him suddenly wants reassurance while another part feels ashamed for needing it. That internal contradiction exhausts people. There's usually a moment later where he realizes he handled the aftermath poorly. Usually alone. Usually too late. Driving home. Lying in bed staring at the ceiling. Replaying the moment her face changed slightly after noticing his distance. And internally there's this awful realization. She thought I stopped caring, when actually he cared so much he panicked. But unfortunately people can only experience the behavior you show them, not the internal explanation you never say out loud. That's why emotional inconsistency damages trust so deeply. Because from her perspective, intimacy became followed by emotional withdrawal repeatedly. And eventually her body starts anticipating abandonment after closeness. That changes her too. She becomes more cautious, more anxious, more self-protective. Eventually, she stops fully relaxing into intimacy because she subconsciously expects the emotional coldness afterward. And honestly, that dynamic can quietly destroy connection over time. Not through screaming fights, through accumulated emotional confusion, through tenderness repeatedly followed by distance, through one person reaching emotionally while the other retreats every time the closeness becomes real. There's also something deeply lonely about men who cannot tolerate softness for long, because underneath the avoidance is usually longing. Longing to stay emotionally open without feeling weak. Longing to receive love without immediately fearing dependence. Longing to stop treating intimacy like danger. But longing alone doesn't heal emotional habits, especially habits built over years. So instead, he pulls away after closeness, gets colder after tenderness, feels safest when the relationship becomes slightly distant again, then misses her intensely once the distance becomes real. That cycle happens more often than people think. And maybe the saddest part is, sometimes the woman interprets his emotional withdrawal after intimacy as proof she imagined the connection entirely. But she didn't. The intimacy was real. His fear was real too. And fortunately, both can exist at the same time. There are conversations he's had with her that she will never hear. Entire paragraphs, apologies, confessions, moments of honesty that existed for maybe 40 seconds inside a glowing text box before disappearing forever under the pressure of pride, fear, confusion, whatever emotion won that night. That's the strange thing about emotionally conflicted men. Sometimes they communicate the most in messages they never send. You can almost track the state of his emotional world by the way he types and deletes, especially late at night. Because nighttime removes distractions. The performance quiets down. The friends stop texting. Work stops numbing him. And suddenly there's just him sitting with thoughts he spent all day out running. That's when the urge to reach out usually hits hardest. Not always because he has clarity. Sometimes because loneliness lowers defenses temporarily. And loneliness makes emotionally avoidant people dangerously honest for short periods of time. Short periods. That part matters. Because the honesty window doesn't always stay open long enough for action. So now, he's lying in bed at 12:47 a.m., brightness turned low on his phone, staring at her name. And his body already knows before his mind admits it. He misses her. Not abstractly. Specifically, he misses her reactions, her timing, the emotional familiarity of talking to someone who already understands the backstory behind his moods. And for a few minutes, the emotional wall drops enough for honesty to start forming. His thumbs move before his pride catches up. Hey, I know I've been weird lately. Pause. Delete. Too vulnerable. Try again. I saw something today that reminded me of you. Pause. Delete again. Too revealing. The problem isn't always that he has nothing to say. Sometimes the problem is that every honest sentence makes him feel emotionally exposed immediately after typing it. Like the vulnerability becomes physically uncomfortable once it's visible on the screen. So he edits himself in real time, softens things, turns emotional truth into something safer, more casual, less dangerous. And eventually the message becomes, "How have you been?" Which is almost insulting compared to what he actually wanted to say. But emotionally guarded people do this constantly. They shrink emotional honesty into manageable pieces. Especially men who are terrified of rejection after emotional exposure. Because sending the real message means risking something unbearable. Confirmation that she no longer cares. Or worse, confirmation that she still does. That scares him to sometimes. People assume emotionally avoidant men fear intimacy only when it's present. Not true. Sometimes they fear re-entering intimacy because they know exactly how deeply it affects them afterward. So now, even sending a text feels emotionally loaded. He overthinks punctuation, reads the message 12 times before sending, wonders if replying too quickly makes him look emotionally weak, pretends not to care while physically holding his breath waiting for the typing bubble to appear. It's honestly a little pathetic sometimes, in a deeply human way. And the contradictions get embarrassing. He tells himself, "I'm done checking her profile," then checks it 30 minutes later. He convinces himself he won't reach out, then starts mentally composing conversations while driving. He says he wants space, then feels irrationally hurt when she stops trying. That contradiction destroys him quietly, because emotionally avoidant men often want connection without the vulnerability required to maintain it, which is impossible. But emotionally, he keeps trying to find a loophole, some way to feel close without feeling exposed. So he lurks emotionally instead, watches from a distance, checks timestamps, rereads old conversations, especially the old conversations. There's something emotionally dangerous about scrolling upward through old messages, because now he sees emotional evidence, proof she cared, proof he cared too, honestly, proof things once felt easy before fear complicated everything, and certain messages hit differently later, especially the ones he barely appreciated in real time. Simple things. "Text me when you get home. You sounded tired today. I'm proud of you." At the time, maybe he responded casually, distracted, half emotionally present. Then months later, he rereads them alone in silence and suddenly realizes how loved he actually was. That realization can hit men extremely late, painfully late, and unfortunately, awareness delayed is still damage done. There's usually one unsent message he keeps mentally rewriting. The honest one. The dangerous one. Not, "I miss you." Deeper than that. Something closer to, I didn't know how to receive what you were giving me without panicking. But even internally, that sentence feels too raw, too exposing. So instead, he says nothing, or sends something emotionally diluted. Memes, random updates, emotionally indirect contact. Because direct emotional honesty feels overwhelming once pride and fear get involved. And honestly, sometimes masculinity itself complicates this. A lot of men are taught emotional control matters more than emotional transparency. So even when they feel devastated internally, they instinctively try to appear unaffected externally, especially to the person who hurt them or the person they hurt. That's why some men would rather disappear than admit emotional confusion honestly. Disappearing preserves dignity temporarily. Vulnerability risks humiliation. At least emotionally, that's how it feels. So now he's trapped in this awful middle space. Too emotionally attached to fully let go. Too emotionally guarded to reconnect honestly. And his phone becomes this weird emotional battlefield. He opens her chat, closes it, opens it again, types, "I've been thinking about you," deletes, types, "I hope you're okay," deletes again, because every version sounds either too cold or too vulnerable. There's no emotionally safe middle anymore. Not once feelings become real. Sometimes he even practices conversations out loud alone, especially while driving. Men do this more than people realize. Half-finished imaginary conversations with someone they can't stop thinking about. She probably thinks I never cared. Well, you acted like you didn't. I know. Then why didn't you say something? Long silence. Because the real answer is usually humiliatingly human. Fear. Not always fear of her. Fear of emotional exposure. Fear of needing someone too much. Fear of saying the honest thing and not being received the way he hoped. So instead he waits too long. That's another pattern. Emotionally conflicted men delay communication until emotions become unbearable internally. Then by the time they finally want to speak honestly, the relationship already feels emotionally fractured. And now shame enters the conversation too. Because he knows he disappeared emotionally, knows he became inconsistent, knows she probably cried over behavior he still struggles to explain clearly himself. That awareness creates hesitation. What if I already ruined it? That question stops a lot of messages from being sent, especially after enough silence passes. Because silence compounds emotionally. The longer he waits, the heavier reaching out feels, and eventually even sending, "Hey," starts feeling emotionally enormous. There's also something people misunderstand about male pride. It's not always arrogance. Sometimes pride is just emotional self-protection wearing arrogance as camouflage. Because admitting, "I handled this badly," or "you mattered more than I admitted," feels emotionally exposing in ways some men genuinely struggle to tolerate, especially men who build identities around emotional composure. So instead of honesty, they become vague, indirect, hard to read, and women often feel confused because his behavior still contains traces of attachment. He watches stories immediately, likes random things months later, finds excuses to reconnect casually, but avoids direct emotional conversations. That inconsistency makes people spiral, because mixed signals create emotional obsession faster than clarity ever does. And honestly, sometimes he knows he's doing it. That's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes he's aware he's hovering emotionally without fully showing up, aware he misses her while still resisting vulnerability, aware his silence is hurting both of them. And yet, he still freezes. Because emotional avoidance is not always logical. It's bodily. His nervous system reacts to emotional closeness like risk. So even when his mind wants connection, his body starts anticipating exposure, rejection, loss of control, emotional engulfment, whatever fear got wired into him years earlier, which creates exhausting internal conflict. One part of him wants to send the honest message immediately. Another part whispers, "Don't do it, you'll regret being this open." And usually whichever part speaks second wins. That's why so many important conversations never happen. Not because the feelings weren't real, because the fear arrived faster than the courage. And maybe the saddest thing about unsent messages is, they create the illusion that emotional truth was never there. From her perspective, silence looks like indifference. Meanwhile, he's rereading old conversations at 2 a.m. feeling emotions he still doesn't fully know how to communicate properly. That doesn't excuse the silence. It doesn't erase the confusion or emotional damage. But sometimes behind a man's distance, there are hundreds of unsent sentences sitting quietly in drafts nobody will ever read. Little digital graveyards of honesty he almost gave you. Almost. The worst moments usually aren't dramatic. That's what surprises him. It's not always the anniversaries. Not always the nights where he drinks too much and starts spiraling emotionally. Not even the moments where he intentionally thinks about her. Sometimes he misses her hardest while doing something completely forgettable. Standing in line at a grocery store, folding laundry, driving home from work with one hand on the steering wheel and absolutely nothing emotionally significant happening at all. That's when it sneaks up on him. Not as heartbreak exactly, more like absence becoming visible. And honestly, ordinary life is where emotional attachment reveals itself most brutally. Because relationships are not built entirely through big moments. They're built through repetition. Tiny interactions, repeated so many times they quietly become part of the nervous system. And men often don't realize how emotionally dependent they became on those tiny interactions until they disappear. That's the delayed realization nobody prepares you for. He thought he'd miss the intensity. Instead, he misses the routine. The stupid routine. Her sending a random picture of something that reminded her of him. The way she'd call at inconvenient times, and somehow he always answered anyway. Her asking if he ate yet in that mildly accusatory tone that secretly made him feel cared for. Tiny things. Things he barely acknowledged while they were happening. That's the painful irony. A lot of emotionally avoidant men recognize emotional value in reverse. Too late. Only after silence replaces consistency. Only after nobody checks on them anymore. And silence changes ordinary life in strange ways. Because now the world still looks the same externally, but emotionally it feels slightly off-center. Like something invisible got removed from the structure of the day. He notices it in fragments, reaching for his phone instinctively before remembering there's nobody to text. Seeing something funny, and still mentally composing the message automatically. Hearing good news, and realizing she's no longer the first person he wants to tell. That realization hurts more than he expects. Because it reveals attachment in ways his pride can't easily dismiss. There's something deeply intimate about becoming someone's reflex. And losing that reflex feels disorienting. Especially for men who spent most of the relationship pretending they needed less emotionally than they actually did. That's another uncomfortable truth. Some men don't understand how emotionally attached they are until their daily life loses emotional texture. Not excitement. Texture. The little emotional exchanges that quietly made life softer. And once those disappear, everything starts feeling strangely flat. Even peaceful things. Especially peaceful things. He'll be sitting at home after work, TV playing in the background, phone face down beside him. And suddenly the silence feels heavier than it used to. Not because he wants noise, Because certain people become emotional atmosphere without you noticing. Their presence changes the feeling of ordinary existence. Then one day they're gone and everything technically functions the same, but emotionally doesn't lend the same weight anymore. The apartment feels colder somehow. Not literally, just psychologically empty. And men notice this in weird ways. He notices nobody moved his hoodie off the couch. Nobody opened the kitchen cabinets incorrectly. Nobody interrupted his overthinking at midnight with random conversation. He used to think he wanted more space. Now the space echoes. That's the cruel part about emotional distance. Sometimes he gets exactly what he asked for, and then realizes too late why he was unhappy inside it. There's usually a moment where the loneliness becomes undeniable. Not dramatic. Quiet. Like ordering food and automatically thinking about what she'd want to. Or hearing a joke and physically turning slightly before remembering she isn't there. The body takes longer to adjust than the ego does. That's why some men continue behaving relationally long after the relationship changes emotionally. His brain still includes her in routines automatically. And honestly, that can make grief feel humiliating. Especially male grief. Because men are often expected to process loss privately and efficiently. No mess. No obsession. No emotional spiraling. Just move on. But emotional attachment doesn't care about social expectations. The body remembers familiarity, whether pride approves or not. That's why random moments become emotionally dangerous. A certain exit on the highway. A coffee shop. A song he didn't even like until she started singing it badly one night in the kitchen. Now suddenly he can't hear it without feeling something tighten in his chest. And the emotional reaction annoys him sometimes. That's important to understand. Not all missing looks romantic externally. Sometimes it looks irritated, restless, emotionally agitated. Because part of him resents how affected he still is. Especially if he was the one who created distance in the first place. That contradiction eats at people quietly. I wanted space. Then why does this feel so empty now? Long silence. Because sometimes what he wanted was relief from emotional overwhelm. Not permanent emotional absence. But emotionally immature people often confuse the two. So now, he's sitting inside the consequences of a silence he partially created himself. And ordinary life keeps exposing the emotional reality he tried to avoid. There's also something strange about how memory attaches itself to physical spaces. The side of the bed she slept on. The grocery aisle where she always took too long deciding things. The passenger seat where her hair tie somehow still exists months later. These objects become emotional evidence, proof someone existed intimately inside his daily life. And removing the evidence can feel weirdly painful. That's why some men leave things and touch longer than they admit. Not consciously always. Sometimes emotionally. A sweatshirt stays hanging on a chair longer than necessary. Pictures stay buried in the phone instead of deleted. Messages remain archived instead of erased. Not because he's intentionally holding on. Because letting go makes the loss feel officially real. And emotionally avoidant men are often better at creating distance than processing finality. That's why grief hits them in delayed waves. Especially during routine. Because routine is where attachment lived most consistently. Not in dramatic declarations. In repetition, in reliability, in text me when you get there, in call me when you leave work, in tiny emotional check-ins that seemed almost insignificant until they disappeared completely. And maybe the loneliest part is, ordinary life doesn't stop moving while someone is grieving quietly. He still goes to work, still answers people normally, still laughs at things occasionally, and everyone assumes he's fine. because externally he functions. But internally there are moments where he feels emotionally ambushed by completely random details. Like seeing her favorite snack unexpectedly, or hearing someone say a phrase she used constantly, or waking up from a dream where everything felt normal again for 5 seconds before reality returned. Those first few waking seconds can be brutal, especially after emotional attachment, because the body forgets before the mind remembers. For half a second, he reaches for the phone expecting her existence to still feel accessible. Then the silence returns. And honestly, some men handle this by becoming busier, work harder, go out more, talk less, keep moving constantly, because stillness leaves room for emotional reality to surface. And ordinary life contains too much stillness. Too many quiet moments where memory slips through. Folding clothes she once wore. Passing places attached to tiny shared memories nobody else would understand. Standing in the kitchen realizing he hasn't cooked properly in weeks because she made ordinary life feel less mechanical somehow. That realization can make emotionally guarded men deeply uncomfortable, because now they have to confront something they spent months minimizing internally. She mattered more than he admitted. Maybe more than he even realized while she was there. There's also guilt hidden inside these ordinary moments sometimes. Specific guilt. Not just, I miss her. More like, I should have appreciated that version of life more while I was living it. That realization arrives quietly, usually alone, usually after enough time passes for defensiveness to weaken. And suddenly he remembers all the moments where she was simply trying to love him in ordinary ways. Bringing him coffee, listening to stories he told badly, waiting for emotional openness that he kept delaying, trying to create closeness while he remained half emotionally guarded all the time. Now those moments replay differently, softer, sadder, because hindsight turns ordinary tenderness into emotional evidence. And unfortunately, people often understand the value of emotional safety only after they no longer have access to it. That's the part nobody says out loud enough. Some men spend the relationship unconsciously resisting intimacy, then spend the aftermath haunted by the absence of it. Not loudly, quietly, in grocery stores, in traffic, in empty apartments, in all the painfully ordinary moments where love used to exist without either person fully realizing how much it held together emotionally until it was gone. There is a version of emotional conflict that almost nobody talks about honestly because it sounds ugly when you say it out loud. Sometimes he resented how much he needed her, not because she did something wrong, not because her love was manipulative, just because dependence itself made him uncomfortable. And honestly, some men would rather sabotage closeness than admit they've become emotionally attached enough to be affected deeply by another person. That's the contradiction. He wanted her, but he hated how much he wanted her. Those are not the same thing. At first, attachment feels exciting, easy even. The texts are effortless. The attention feels natural. He likes that someone understands him. But then something shifts quietly. He starts noticing her emotional impact on him. His mood changes depending on her tone. Her distance affects his nervous system. One short reply from her can ruin the emotional atmosphere of his whole evening. And suddenly, what once felt comforting starts feeling dangerous too. Because now she matters. Now there's emotional leverage. And some men panic internally when they realize someone has become emotionally important enough to destabilize them. Especially men who built their identity around self-containment. Men who learned early, handle it yourself. Don't need too much. Don't become emotionally dependent. Stay composed. Then love enters the room and ruins that entire system quietly. Now he's checking his phone more than he wants to admit. thinking about her while pretending to focus, replaying conversations during workouts, missing her immediately after leaving her. And part of him feels deeply comforted by that connection. Another part feels trapped by it. That's the emotional contradiction underneath a lot of masculine withdrawal. Not, I don't care. More like, I care enough that it scares me. But fear doesn't always look afraid externally. Sometimes it looks irritated, detached, emotionally unavailable. That's why some men become colder exactly when the relationship becomes emotionally safer. Because safety increases attachment, and attachment exposes need. There's something deeply vulnerable about realizing another person can soothe parts of you that you previously managed alone. Even healthy love can trigger resistance in people who associate emotional independence with survival. So now he's sitting there beside someone who genuinely cares about him. And instead of fully relaxing into it, part of him starts mentally resisting the dependency forming underneath the connection. You can sometimes see this happen in small behavioral shifts. She becomes more emotionally consistent with him, and suddenly he becomes slightly harder to reach. Not fully absent, just less available, a little more distracted, a little slower to respond, almost like he's unconsciously trying to prove to himself, I'm still independent, I still have control over this. Because emotional dependence terrifies some men more than loneliness does. Loneliness feels familiar, dependence feels risky. And if he has old emotional wounds around trust, abandonment, criticism, failure, emotional engulfment, whatever shaped him years ago, being loved consistently can actually activate fear instead of relief. That confuses people, especially women who are loving sincerely. Because from her perspective, she's offering emotional safety. From his perspective, he's slowly losing emotional distance. And emotional distance was how he stayed safe his entire life. There's usually a moment where he realizes, she can affect me now. That realization changes things internally, not dramatically, quietly. He notices himself wanting her reassurance more, wanting her attention, wanting her emotional presence after difficult days. And instead of just accepting that naturally, he feels ashamed of it. That shame matters more than people realize. Because emotionally immature men often experience emotional need as weakness instead of intimacy. So instead of saying, I think I'm getting attached, they become defensive, sarcastic, withdrawn, emotionally confusing. Sometimes he even starts subtly pushing her away emotionally after moments where he felt especially connected to her. Not because the connection was fake, because the connection made him aware of his dependence. And awareness creates vulnerability. There is an internal conversation happening underneath all this that he rarely says out loud. Something like, this is getting too serious. Is that bad? I don't know. Then why are you pulling away? Because I can feel myself needing her. Long silence. That silence right there explains more relationships than people realize. Because needing someone sounds romantic in theory, until you're the one suddenly vulnerable to loss. That's when panic enters. Especially for men who spent years emotionally self-protecting through detachment. Some men genuinely don't know how to receive consistent love without subconsciously fighting it. Not because they enjoy hurting people, because stability exposes unresolved fear. That's why emotionally avoidant behavior can become strongest exactly when the relationship becomes emotionally intimate. Now she sees him clearly. Now she knows his routines. Now she notices his mood shifts. Now she matters enough emotionally that losing her would actually hurt. And instead of softening into that truth, part of him starts resisting it. There's also resentment sometimes toward how much emotional space she occupies in his mind. That's another ugly truth. He can miss her constantly while simultaneously feeling irritated that he misses her at all, especially during separation or emotional distance. Because now he can't fully control where his mind goes anymore. He'll be trying to focus on work, then suddenly remembering something small she said 3 weeks ago, trying to enjoy time with friends, then instinctively checking his phone hoping her name appears. And part of him internally reacts with frustration. Why am I still thinking about this? Because attachment bypassed logic already. That's why emotionally avoidant men often look emotionally inconsistent. One part of them deeply craves closeness. Another part resents the emotional vulnerability attached to it. So their behavior becomes contradictory. They seek connection, then emotionally retreat once they receive it. They miss her, then become distant when she gets emotionally close again. They want reassurance, then feel ashamed for needing reassurance afterward. That contradiction exhausts both people eventually, especially the woman trying to understand why affection keeps getting followed by emotional withdrawal. And honestly, sometimes he doesn't understand it clearly either. Not in real time. Later maybe. Much later. But during the relationship, a lot of his behavior feels emotionally reactive instead of emotionally conscious. That's why he can genuinely love someone while still creating emotional instability around the relationship. Love alone doesn't automatically create emotional maturity. Sometimes it actually exposes the lack of it, especially in men who learned how to pursue love, but never learned how to tolerate emotional dependence once they found it. There's also a specific kind of panic that happens when he realizes she's becoming emotionally central to his life. Not just romantically important, structurally important, meaning she's part of his daily regulation now, part of his emotional routine, part of how he decompresses, processes, stabilizes. And that level of integration scares men who fear loss deeply, because now there's something real at stake. Now, if she leaves, something inside his life emotionally collapses with her. So instead of fully surrendering emotionally, he sometimes creates distance preemptively, a subconscious attempt to reduce vulnerability before vulnerability reduces him. Of course, this usually creates the exact loneliness he feared in the first place. But fear rarely behaves logically. Fear behaves protectively, and protection often ruins intimacy quietly. There's usually a point where she starts feeling the emotional resistance. She notices he's emotionally elsewhere sometimes, not fully present. Like part of him is holding back even during moments of closeness. And often she interprets that as lack of love. But sometimes the truth is more complicated. Sometimes he's holding back because the love became too emotionally important. That doesn't make the behavior healthy. It still hurts, still confuses, still creates insecurity and emotional exhaustion. But internally, what's happening is often less. I don't care, and more. I care enough that I'm losing the version of myself that felt emotionally untouchable. That loss of emotional control terrifies certain men, especially men praised their whole lives for composure, independence, stoicism, restraint. Then suddenly one person enters their life and makes them emotionally softer, more reactive, more vulnerable, more human. Part of them loves that transformation. Part of them deeply resents it. And maybe the saddest thing is, sometimes the resentment was never truly toward her. It was toward the helpless feeling of realizing he could no longer pretend he didn't need anybody. Because once someone becomes emotionally significant enough, the illusion of total self-sufficiency dies quietly. And not every man knows how to grieve that version of himself gracefully. One of the biggest mistakes people make when trying to understand men emotionally is believing emotional silence means emotional stability. It doesn't. Sometimes silence just means he's trying to survive his feelings privately. And men are very good at looking functional while emotionally unraveling underneath. Disturbingly good, honestly. That's why people around him often think he moved on long before he actually did. Because externally, he seems okay. He still goes to work, still answers messages, still posts normal things online, still laughs at jokes at dinner. Maybe he even starts talking to other people casually. And everyone around him interprets that behavior as emotional recovery. Meanwhile, internally, he's barely holding emotional balance together some nights. That disconnect between external composure and internal chaos is where a lot of masculine suffering hides, especially after emotional loss. Because many men are conditioned very early to translate pain into performance. Keep functioning, keep moving, stay composed. Don't become emotionally messy in public. So instead of processing emotions directly, he manages optics, even with himself, especially with himself. That's the strange part. Sometimes he's not even consciously lying to other people. He's trying to convince himself he's fine too, which creates this bizarre emotional split. During the day, he genuinely believes, "I'm okay, it is what it is." Then, at 1:30 a.m., he's sitting alone replaying old conversations while feeling emotionally wrecked over one sentence she said months ago. The emotional suppression catches up eventually. It always does. Just not on schedule. And delayed grief confuses people because it doesn't look dramatic at first. It looks detached. That's why emotionally avoidant men often appear calm immediately after separation or emotional distance. Sometimes they even seem relieved initially. And honestly, part of them is relieved. Relieved the emotional pressure stopped. Relieved the vulnerability eased temporarily. Relief they no longer feel emotionally exposed every day. But relief and grief can exist simultaneously. That's the contradiction nobody explains well. The space feels calming at first, until the loneliness underneath the relief starts becoming visible. Then everything shifts quietly, usually later than expected. Much later sometimes. Weeks, months. And by then, everyone assumes he's over it already. That isolation makes the grief even stranger. Because now, he feels emotionally behind everyone else's timeline. He can't exactly tell his friends. Actually, I think I'm just now realizing how attached I was. Especially if he spent months acting emotionally unaffected. So, instead he minimizes it. That's what a lot of men do with emotional pain. Shrink it verbally while carrying it heavily internally. Friends ask, "You good?" And he says, "Yeah, I'm chilling." Meanwhile, he hasn't slept properly in 2 weeks. That kind of emotional dishonesty becomes automatic for some men. Not maliciously, conditioned. Because emotional suffering often feels safer when disguised as exhaustion, stress, distraction, irritation, anything except heartbreak. Especially heartbreak tied to vulnerability. There's also ego involved. Not in a cruel way necessarily. More like emotional self-protection. Because admitting someone affected him deeply after he acted distant, avoidant, inconsistent, or emotionally unavailable creates shame. Now, he has to confront painful realities simultaneously. He misses her, and he partially created the distance himself. That combination can emotionally trap people for a long time, especially proud people, especially emotionally avoidant men, because now every feeling comes mixed with guilt. He misses her voice, but remembers ignoring her emotional needs sometimes. He misses the closeness, but remembers pulling away after intimacy. He misses her patience, but remembers acting emotionally unavailable while she was trying to connect with him sincerely. That kind of regret becomes emotionally exhausting because it's not clean grief. It's self-confrontation. And honestly, many men avoid self-confrontation for as long as possible. So instead, they distract themselves aggressively. More work, more noise, more casual conversations, more scrolling, more staying busy for no real reason. Anything to avoid sitting still long enough for the emotional reality to become undeniable. Because stillness exposes everything. That's why nighttime becomes dangerous emotionally. There's nowhere left to escape mentally. No performance required. No distractions strong enough. Just him and the thoughts he spent all day suppressing. That's when the pretending starts breaking down. He checks her profile again even though he promised himself he wouldn't. Reads old messages. Thinks about reaching out. Starts replaying tiny moments emotionally. And suddenly the version of himself that claimed it's whatever completely disappears. Now he's just a person grieving privately. A person who misses someone. A person who maybe didn't know how to love properly while he had the chance. And there's something deeply lonely about grieving quietly while everyone assumes you're fine. Especially for men. Because male emotional pain often gets translated socially into silence instead of support. People notice women grieving. Men disappear into routine and call it coping. That's why some men emotionally collapse much later than expected. Not because they felt less initially, because they delayed the feeling process entirely. There's usually a moment where the emotional suppression stops working fully. And honestly, it's often triggered by something embarrassingly small. Not a huge emotional event. Something stupid. Hearing her favorite artist playing in a store. Finding an old receipt in the car. Accidentally seeing an old picture while looking for something else. And suddenly the emotional wall cracks unexpectedly. That's when he realizes, oh, I'm not over this at all. That realization can feel humiliating for emotionally guarded men, especially if they spent months insisting they were unaffected. Now, their own nervous system is contradicting the story they've been telling themselves. And bodies don't lie very well emotionally. That's another thing people underestimate. You can mentally minimize attachment for months, but your body still reacts. Sleep changes. Appetite changes. Concentration changes. Certain memories create physical tension instantly. He sees her name unexpectedly and his stomach drops before his mind even catches up. That physical response frustrates him sometimes, because part of him genuinely wants to move on cleanly, wants emotional control back, wants to stop caring so much. But emotional attachment doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. Especially not unresolved attachment. There's also a specific sadness that appears when he realizes she probably thinks he never cared deeply. That thought destroys certain men quietly, because internally he knows the feelings were real, even if his behavior failed to communicate them properly. And unfortunately, people experience your actions more than your internal intentions. So now, he's left carrying this weird emotional contradiction. He feels heartbreak privately, while knowing he often looked emotionally detached publicly. That disconnect creates loneliness too, because nobody fully sees what's happening internally. Not even the people closest to him sometimes. Friends might see him joking around normally one night. Then he goes home afterward and sits in his parked car for 20 extra minutes because he suddenly feels emotionally hollow again. That's how delayed grief behaves sometimes. In waves, not consistency. One day he feels genuinely okay. The next day something random emotionally destabilizes him completely. And because men are often taught to solve emotions instead of feel them, He keeps trying to fix the sadness intellectually. Maybe if he understands it better, it'll stop hurting. Maybe if he dates someone else, it'll disappear faster. Maybe if he ignores it hard enough, eventually it'll dissolve naturally. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Especially when the connection exposed parts of him emotionally that nobody else reached before. Those relationships leave residue. Not mystical residue. Human residue. Behavioral residue. Emotional residue. Patterns of attachment that remain inside ordinary life long after the relationship changes form. And maybe the saddest part is, sometimes by the time he fully admits how affected he actually is, she's already emotionally exhausted from trying to understand him, already detached herself, already stopped reaching emotionally. That timing happens constantly in emotionally avoidant dynamics. He delays vulnerability until the relationship loses emotional oxygen completely. Then suddenly he wants honesty after months of distance and confusion. But people cannot survive indefinitely inside emotional uncertainty. Eventually, they protect themselves too. And when that finally happens, when she genuinely begins pulling away emotionally, that's often when the pretending stops working entirely for him. Because now the loss feels real. Not theoretical. Not temporary space. Real. And suddenly all the emotions he postponed come flooding in at once. The grief, the regret, the longing, the guilt, the unbearable awareness of how much he actually cared beneath all the avoidance. But by then, he's usually sitting alone with feelings he waited too long to admit even to himself. At first, he thinks the distance is temporary. That's important. Even after the silence starts, even after the conversations become colder, even after she stops reaching the same way. Part of him still believes she's emotionally there, still accessible, still emotionally orbiting him somehow. And honestly, that belief changes the way he behaves. Because as long as he thinks she's still emotionally available, he doesn't fully confront the possibility of losing her. Not really. That's why some men move strangely during emotional separation. Detached 1 week, curious the next, watching quietly from a distance while assuming there's still time. Time to explain later. Time to fix it later. Time to become emotionally ready later. But later is dangerous. Because people leave emotionally before they leave visibly. And men often notice the visible absence long after the emotional shift already happened. That's the delayed realization. She stopped fighting for the connection before he realized how serious the damage actually was. At first, he interprets her withdrawal incorrectly. He thinks she just needs space. Or she's upset. Or maybe she'll come back around eventually. Because emotionally avoidant men are used to emotional pauses, used to distance, used to reconnecting after withdrawal cycles. So he assumes this is another cycle, not an ending, until one day something feels different, subtly different, not dramatic. Actually, that's what makes it terrifying. The emotional energy changes first. Her responses become calmer, less emotional, less reactive. She stops trying to decode him constantly, stops pushing for reassurance, stops asking the questions she used to ask. And at first he might even feel relief. That's the awful part, because the emotional pressure disappears. No more difficult conversations, no more emotional tension, no more feeling confronted by her needs or disappointment. Everything becomes quieter, easier, but then eventually the silence changes texture. It no longer feels like temporary distance. It feels like absence, real absence. And human beings can feel the difference instinctively, especially when someone emotionally detaches for real. There is a point where her attention no longer reaches for him automatically. And when that happens, something primitive activates inside him. Because now his nervous system notices what his ego ignored earlier. She stopped emotionally waiting for him. That realization destabilizes people, especially men who unconsciously relied on her emotional availability while pretending to need less than they actually did. There's usually one moment where it hits him fully. One moment that feels strangely small, but emotionally irreversible. Maybe she no longer watches his stories immediately. Maybe she replies politely instead of warmly. Maybe she sounds genuinely okay without him for the first time. That one hurts. Not because he wanted her miserable, but because emotionally avoidant people often assume emotional permanence unconsciously. They assume the connection will remain accessible while they figure themselves out. So when she actually detaches, it shocks him, especially if she was patient for a long time, especially if she kept trying emotionally while he stayed conflicted. Because now he's forced to confront a terrifying possibility. She may finally be letting go for real, and the body reacts before the mind forms language around it. Sleep changes. Restlessness increases. Suddenly he's checking his phone more often, thinking about reaching out more urgently, feeling emotionally panic in random moments. Not loud panic, quiet panic. The kind that sits in your chest all day. The kind that makes ordinary silence feel threatening. And maybe for the first time, he stops feeling emotionally powerful inside the distance. That's important too, because emotional withdrawal can create a temporary illusion of control. As long as she keeps reaching emotionally, part of him still feels chosen, still feels emotionally central, even while pulling away. But once she genuinely steps back, the illusion collapses. Now he feels the loss too. Now he feels uncertainty. Now he feels what she was carrying emotionally for months. And honestly, some men become emotionally honest only after they lose emotional control of the situation entirely. Not because they're manipulative necessarily, because certainty allowed them to avoid vulnerability. Loss removes that certainty. There is a brutal internal moment that happens around this stage, usually late at night, usually alone. He opens her profile, not even consciously expecting anything, just habit. And suddenly he realizes he no longer knows what's happening in her life emotionally. That disconnect hits hard, because she used to tell him everything, or almost everything. Now he's outside her emotional world looking in through fragments, pictures, captions, silence, and people underestimate how psychologically destabilizing that feels after emotional intimacy, especially for men who are not used to emotional displacement. Now somebody else might become the person she sends things to first. Somebody else might hear about her day. Somebody else might receive the softness he took for granted while resisting closeness. That realization creates grief fast, and jealousy to sometimes. Not always romantic jealousy, existential jealousy. The pain of realizing life continued moving without him emotionally. There's usually an internal dialogue happening underneath all this. One he rarely says aloud. She's really leaving. You pushed her away. I know. Then why didn't you stop? Long silence. Because emotionally avoidant behavior often makes sense emotionally in the short term, while destroying connection slowly in the long term. And now, he's watching consequences thrive after the emotional adrenaline wears off. That's when regret becomes clearer. Not abstract regret. Specific regret. Specific moments. Specific times he could have softened but didn't. Could have reassured her but stayed distant instead. Could have answered honestly, but chose emotional safety over emotional intimacy. Now, those moments replay differently. Now he sees her exhaustion, her confusion, the gradual sadness she carried while trying to love someone emotionally inconsistent. And honestly, realizing you hurt someone who genuinely loved you creates a specific kind of grief. Because now the loss isn't just about missing her. It's about confronting yourself. Confronting the version of you that stayed emotionally guarded while someone else kept trying. That awareness can crack people open emotionally, especially men who spent the relationship intellectualizing their feelings instead of fully feeling them. Because now there's no emotional buffer left. She's actually slipping away. And suddenly the emotions arrive all at once. The attachment, the longing, the panic, the tenderness, the delayed understanding of how deeply integrated she became in his inner life. That's why some men suddenly reach out intensely after long periods of distance. Not because the feelings suddenly appeared, because denial stopped working, and desperation changes emotional behavior quickly. Now he wants to explain things he avoided explaining before, wants to reconnect emotionally, wants reassurance that it's not too late. But timing matters in relationships. And emotional readiness arriving after someone emotionally burns out creates tragedy constantly. Because by the time he's finally ready to stop running emotionally, she may already be exhausted from chasing clarity. That imbalance breaks people, especially women who spent months trying to understand emotional inconsistency while slowly abandoning themselves in the process. There's also something painfully human about how men react once they realize her attention truly shifted elsewhere emotionally. Suddenly, he notices everything he ignored before. Her silence, her absence, the fact she no longer asks how he's doing, no longer reaches for him emotionally after difficult days, no longer tries to repair every emotional fracture between them. And the loss of that emotional labor becomes visible immediately once it stops. That's another uncomfortable truth. Some men only recognize how much emotional effort a woman was carrying after she puts it down completely. Then suddenly the relationship feels empty, because she was holding together emotional intimacy almost alone for months. And once she stops, there's nothing left cushioning the distance anymore. Just reality. There's a moment where he realizes, she's learning how to live without me emotionally. That realization can humble men brutally, because emotionally avoidant men often assume emotional permanence unconsciously. They assume the person who loves them deeply will continue wading through confusion indefinitely. But people eventually reach emotional exhaustion, especially when love keeps meeting emotional resistance. And once she genuinely detaches, once she truly starts reclaiming herself emotionally, he often feels the full emotional weight of the relationship for the first time without defensive numbness protecting him. That's why the grief suddenly feels unbearable. Not because the love became deeper overnight, because the possibility of permanent loss finally became real enough to penetrate the avoidance. And maybe the saddest part is, sometimes the moment he fully realizes she's gone is the exact moment she finally started healing. Some men don't understand the relationship while they're inside it. They understand it afterward, in reverse. And honestly, that's one of the most painful parts of emotional immaturity. The awareness arrives late, not because the feelings weren't real at the time, because self-awareness wasn't. So while the relationship is happening, he's mostly reacting, protecting himself, avoiding discomfort, trying to manage emotional intensity without fully understanding what's driving his behavior underneath. And from the outside, it can look cruel sometimes, especially to the person trying to love him sincerely, because she's responding to the impact of his actions, while he's still trapped inside the confusion of his internal reactions. That mismatch creates so much damage. She experiences distance, inconsistency, emotional withdrawal. Meanwhile, internally, he experiences pressure, fear, attachment, overwhelm, confusion. But he often lacks the emotional vocabulary to connect the two in real time. So instead of saying, "I think I'm getting scared because this relationship matters to me," he says, "I just need space." And maybe he even believes the explanation initially. Partially. But emotional truth has layers. And emotionally avoidant men tend to discover those layers painfully slowly. That's why hindsight becomes brutal. Because eventually enough silence passes, enough loneliness settles, and enough emotional defensiveness weakens. And suddenly he starts understanding things he could not see clearly before. Tiny moments replay differently now. Arguments sound different in memory. Her reactions make more sense. He starts realizing she wasn't too emotional all the time. Sometimes she was emotionally exhausted. Sometimes she was responding to inconsistency he minimized because he was too busy protecting himself internally. That realization hurts, especially when he remembers how calm he stayed externally while she was unraveling emotionally, trying to hold the connection together. There's a specific kind of shame that appears when someone finally sees the emotional reality of their own behavior clearly. Not performative shame, private shame. The kind that hits in random quiet moments. Driving alone, taking a shower, lying awake at 2 a.m. replaying conversations differently than before. And suddenly he hears things he missed emotionally in real time. Not just her words. Her exhaustion underneath the words. That changes everything. He remembers her asking, "Why do you become distant every time we get close?" At the time, maybe he felt defensive, misunderstood, pressured. Now, months later, he realizes she was genuinely trying to understand him, not attack him. And maybe the saddest part is, sometimes she understood his emotional patterns before he did. Women often notice emotional shifts long before men consciously acknowledge them. That's why she kept asking questions he wasn't emotionally ready to answer yet. Questions like, "What are you scared of? Why do you pull away afterward? Why do I feel you disappear emotionally when things get deeper?" And at the time he probably thought, "She's overthinking." Now he sits alone realizing, no, she was noticing reality. That delayed understanding can emotionally wreck people. Because hindsight removes emotional self-protection slowly. At first, he only remembers the parts where he felt overwhelmed. Now, he starts remembering her loneliness too. Her confusion. The way she tried to reconnect gently before eventually becoming emotionally tired. And regret becomes more specific over time. That's the horrible thing about emotional clarity arriving late. The details sharpen. Now, he remembers exact moments he emotionally failed her. Not in monstrous ways necessarily. Human ways. Subtle ways. Moments where softness was needed and he responded with distance instead. Moments where reassurance would have changed everything, but he stayed emotionally guarded because vulnerability made him uncomfortable. Moments where she reached for honesty and he avoided it because he didn't fully understand his own emotions yet. That's what people mean when they say some men process relationships backward. The emotional understanding comes after the damage, after the silence, after the nervous system finally slows down enough for self-awareness to surface. And honestly, some men are shocked by how much they misunderstood their own feelings in real time. He thought he wanted freedom. Turns out he wanted emotional safety without vulnerability. He thought he needed space. Turns out he needed emotional regulation skills. He thought she was too much. Turns out she was responding normally to emotional inconsistency. That kind of realization humbles people deeply, especially proud men. Especially emotionally avoidant men who spent most of the relationship convincing themselves they were less affected than they actually were. There's usually an internal conversation happening during this stage. One that sounds painfully honest compared to the emotional detachment he showed earlier. I really hurt her. Yes, but I loved her. I know. Then why did I act like that? Long silence. Because love and emotional capacity are not always equal. That's one of the hardest truths. Someone can genuinely care deeply and still lack the emotional maturity to sustain intimacy properly. That doesn't erase the damage, but it explains why some relationships feel emotionally tragic instead of emotionally malicious. Because underneath the avoidance was often fear. Underneath the distance was confusion. Underneath the emotional inconsistency was someone trying to protect themselves without realizing they were slowly destroying the connection too. And unfortunately, understanding that late doesn't automatically repair what was broken. That's another painful realization. Self-awareness arriving after emotional exhaustion has already set and changes the emotional tone completely. Now, he wants to explain himself, wants to communicate honestly, wants to say, I see it now. But she may already be emotionally detached by then, already tired, already rebuilding herself, or spending too long trying to emotionally interpret someone who wouldn't fully let her in. That timing creates heartbreak on both sides. Because now he finally understands the relationship emotionally. Just as she stops believing understanding will ever come. There's also grief inside delayed self-awareness. Not just grief over losing her. Grief over the version of himself he was during the relationship. Because now he has to confront how fear shaped his behavior. How pride delayed honesty. How emotional avoidance made him confuse distance with control. That confrontation can feel deeply uncomfortable for men taught to value composure over introspection, especially when they realize how much tenderness they rejected defensively. There's a moment where he remembers something incredibly small, and suddenly understands its emotional significance years too late. Maybe she stopped asking for reassurance near the end. At the time, he interpreted that as progress. Less pressure. Less emotional intensity. Now he realizes. She stopped asking because she was emotionally giving up. That realization can break something inside a person quietly. Because now he sees the emotional timeline clearly. He sees when she started becoming tired. Sees when her hope weakened. Sees how many times she tried to reconnect before eventually protecting herself emotionally. And maybe for the first time, he stops seeing himself only as misunderstood. Now he sees himself as emotionally avoidant too. That shift matters. Because emotionally avoidant people often experience themselves as overwhelmed victims of emotional pressure during the relationship. Only later do they recognize how their withdrawal affected the other person psychologically. The anxiety, the confusion, the constant uncertainty, and realizing someone loved you through all that while slowly breaking internally creates unbearable guilt sometimes, especially when the relationship contained real tenderness too. That's what makes these situations emotionally complicated. If the relationship had been entirely toxic, the grief would feel cleaner. But it wasn't entirely toxic. There was love there, real moments, real intimacy, real emotional safety trying to form between two imperfect people. That's why the regret lingers. Because part of him knows things could have been different if he understood himself earlier. If he communicated honestly earlier. If he stopped running emotionally every time vulnerability appeared. But human beings rarely evolve on ideal timelines. Sometimes growth arrives through loss. Sometimes self-awareness arrives through regret. And maybe the cruelest part of all is that some men become emotionally capable only after losing the person who was trying to love them patiently all along. Not because the loss magically transformed them. Because the loss finally forced them to sit still long enough to see themselves clearly. No distractions. No emotional escape routes. No blaming chemistry or timing or stress. Just the uncomfortable truth sitting in front of them quietly. Part of the relationship ended because he didn't understand his own heart until it was already too late to protect what mattered. There's a version of the truth he may never fully say out loud. Not because it isn't real. Because some feelings become easier to carry privately than exposed directly to another person. Especially after damage. Especially after silence. Especially after becoming the kind of man who accidentally hurts someone while trying not to feel vulnerable himself. And honestly, some men spend years emotionally translating things internally that never fully make it into words externally. So, if he were completely honest, painfully honest, maybe it would sound less poetic than people expect. Less wise. More human. Something like, I didn't know how to be loved without becoming scared. Not scared of her exactly. Scared of what happened inside him around her. That's the part he rarely explains. Because people see the withdrawal, the inconsistency, the distance after intimacy, but they don't always see the internal panic underneath it. The way emotional closeness made him feel exposed in ways he didn't know how to regulate. The way being genuinely cared for brought up emotions he spent years avoiding successfully. The way he sometimes wanted to stay and run at the exact same time. That contradiction exhausted him too. Even if she carried the heavier emotional confusion. There's a specific sadness in realizing you kept resisting the very thing you secretly needed most. And some men don't fully realize that until it's over. Until the emotional noise quiets down. Until there's nobody left reaching for them anymore. That's when the honesty gets louder internally. Not performative honesty. Not dramatic movie scene honesty. The small, brutal kind. Like realizing he checked his phone every morning hoping to see her name long before he admitted she mattered deeply. Or realizing the moments he felt most emotionally irritated were often the moments he felt most emotionally attached to. That sounds irrational. Because it is. Human emotion is irrational sometimes. Especially when attachment collides with fear. There were probably moments where he genuinely wanted to tell her the truth. Moments where the emotional wall almost dropped completely. Usually during ordinary intimacy. Late-night conversations. Quiet drives. Moments after laughter softened both of them enough to stop performing. Those moments matter. Because emotionally guarded men often reveal themselves accidentally in fragments. A look that lasts too long. A sentence that slips out before they can edit it. The way their voice changes when they're emotionally tired. Tiny cracks in the armor. And maybe she noticed them all. Maybe that's part of why this hurts so much. Because she could feel the love underneath the fear. Feel the tenderness underneath the withdrawal. Feel the attachment underneath the emotional confusion. But feeling someone's hidden love is not the same as being safely loved by them consistently. That's another painful truth. Potential is not safety. Internal feelings are not emotional availability. And sometimes he understands that too late. There's usually a moment where he realizes, she needed consistency from me, not hidden depth. That realization humbles people. Because emotionally avoidant men often assume their internal feelings should somehow compensate for their external inconsistency. But relationships don't survive on hidden intentions. They survive on repeated emotional safety. And maybe if he were honest, really honest, he would admit he sometimes expected her to keep understanding him emotionally while he avoided fully understanding himself. That's exhausting for another person, especially someone trying to love patiently. There's guilt in that realization, not theatrical guilt. The quiet kind. The kind that shows up while washing dishes alone, or while hearing a phrase she used to say casually, or while lying awake realizing she probably cried over things he minimized at the time because emotional accountability made him uncomfortable. That awareness changes the emotional memory of the relationship completely. Now he remembers moments differently. Moments where she wasn't too emotional. She was tired. Moments where she wasn't asking for too much. She was asking for emotional clarity. Moments where she reached toward him gently. And he responded with confusion because vulnerability still felt like danger inside his body. And maybe the hardest truth he'll never fully admit out loud is this. Part of him thought if he loved her openly, he would lose control of himself emotionally. That fear shaped more behavior than he realized, because some men equate emotional restraint with safety. So when love starts softening them deeply, they panic. Not dramatically, behaviorally. They delay replies, need more space suddenly, become emotionally inconsistent after closeness. And from the outside, it looks like loss of interest. Sometimes, internally, it's fear of emotional dependence. There's also grief in realizing how much unnecessary distance he created. How many moments he emotionally complicated because he didn't know how to tolerate vulnerability peacefully. And maybe now, alone with hindsight, he can finally admit certain things privately. Like how much he noticed, how much he cared, how often he replayed tiny moments afterward. The way she touched his arm while talking. The way she'd become quieter when hurt instead of louder. The way her presence changed the emotional atmosphere of his life completely without him fully understanding it while it was happening. He probably misses things she never even realized mattered to him. That's the strange thing about emotionally guarded men. Sometimes they carry deep emotional details silently. They just don't communicate it well in real time. And unfortunately, relationships happen in real time, not hindsight. That's why delayed emotional honesty feels tragic sometimes. Because now he finally has the language for feelings he couldn't explain while she was still standing in front of him asking for clarity. Now he understands why he pulled away after intimacy, why closeness made him restless, why he became colder after moments that actually mattered deeply to him. But understanding later does not erase what the other person survived emotionally while waiting. That realization hurts too, especially if she loved him through confusion he now recognizes more clearly himself. There is a private internal dialogue some men eventually reach during healing. Not spiritual, not dramatic, just painfully self-aware. You loved her. Yes. Then why didn't you act like it consistently? Because I was scared. Of what? Long silence. Then finally, of needing someone enough to lose emotional control. That's the part beneath so much masculine avoidance. Not lack of feeling. Fear of dependence. Fear of exposure. Fear of being emotionally seen too clearly. And maybe underneath all of it, he genuinely wanted to be softer than he knew how to be. That's the heartbreaking part. Some men were never taught how to stay emotionally open once intimacy became real. So they close, retreat, complicate things. Not because love wasn't there, because emotional survival habits were stronger than emotional awareness at the time. And honestly, some men spend years trying to become the version of themselves that could have loved her properly. Not for her anymore necessarily, for themselves. Because eventually they get tired of running from intimacy too. Tired of creating loneliness accidentally. Tired of confusing emotional self-protection with strength. There's usually one final realization that stays with him longest. Not, I lost her. Deeper than that. Something closer to. She was trying to love me while I was still afraid of being loved fully. That realization changes people quietly, especially when they finally understand how much tenderness they rejected defensively. And maybe the saddest thing of all is, if you asked him directly whether he loved her, he still might struggle to answer cleanly. Not because the answer is no, because the truth feels bigger and messier than the language he was taught to use. So instead, he might pause, look away for a second, act calmer than he actually feels. And somewhere underneath all the silence, avoidance, pride, regret, longing, confusion, tenderness, fear, and delayed understanding, the most honest thing inside him might simply be, part of me really did want to stay. I just didn't know how to stay open without feeling terrified of what it meant.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.